Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 351, Manikundala Jataka. Stripped of all the joys of life, etc. This story the master, while dwelling at Jetavana, told concerning a counselor who was guilty of misconduct in the harem of the king of Kosala. The incident that gave rise to the story has been given in full before. Here too the Bodhisattva became king in Benares. The wicked counselor called in the king of Kosala, and got him to seize upon the kingdom of Kasi, and to throw the Bodhisattva into prison. The king of Benares developed ecstatic meditation, and sat cross-legged in the air. A fierce heat sprang up in the body of the marauding king, and he drew nigh to the king of Benares, and repeated the first stanza. Stripped of all the joys of life, jeweled earrings, horse and car, robbed of child and loving wife, not thy pleasure seems to mar. On hearing him the Bodhisattva recited these verses. Pleasures soon make haste to leave us. Pleasure soon must all forego. Sorrow has no power to grieve us. Joy itself soon turns to woe. Moons with new-born orb appearing, wax a while to wane and die. Suns with warmth all nature cheering, haste to set in yonder sky. Change is this world's law I see. Sorrow has no pangs for me. Thus now did the great being expound the truth to the usurper king, and bringing his conduct to the test, repeated these stanzas. The idle sensual layman I detest. The false ascetic is a rogue confiest. A bad king will a case unheard decide. Wrath in the sage can ne'er be justified. The warrior prince a well-weighed verdict gives. Of righteous judge the fame forever lives. The king of Kosala, having thus gained the forgiveness of the Bodhisattva, and given him back his kingdom, departed to his own country. The master, having ended his discourse, thus identified the birth. At that time Ananda was the king of Kosala, and I myself was the king of Benares. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 352, Sujata Jataka. Why haste to bring, etc. This story the master, while dwelling at Jetavana, told concerning a landowner who had lost his father. On the death of his father, they say, he went about lamenting, quite unable to shake off his grief. The master perceived in the man a capacity to attain to the fruit of salvation, and when he went his rounds in Savatthi for alms, accompanied by an attendant priest, he came to his house, and sitting down on the seat prepared for him he bowed to his host, who was also seated, and said, Lay brother, art thou grieving? And on his replying, Yes, reverend sir, I am, he said, Friend, sages of old hearkened to the words of wisdom, and when they lost a father, they did not grieve. And at the request of his host, he told a story of the olden time. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, the Bodhisattva came to life in the house of a landowner, and they called him young Sujata. When he was grown up, his grandsire died. Then his father from the day of the old man's death was filled with sorrow, and taking his bones from the place of cremation he erected an earth mound in his pleasure garden, and depositing the remains there, whenever he visited the place, adorned the tope with flowers and studiously lamented, neither bathing nor anointing himself nor eating. Neither did he attend to his business. The Bodhisattva, on observing this, thought, My father ever since the death of my grandfather goes about overwhelmed with grief, and no one, I am sure, except myself has power to console him. I will find a way to deliver him from his sorrow. So seeing a dead ox lying outside the city, he brought grass and water, and placing them before it said, Eat and drink, eat and drink. All that passed by on seeing this said, Friend Sujata, are you mad? Do you offer grass and water to a dead ox? But he answered not a word. So they went to his father and said, Your son has become mad. He is giving grass and water to a dead ox. On hearing this the landowner ceased to grieve for his father, and began to grieve for his son. And he went in haste and cried, My dear Sujata, are you not in your sober senses? Why do you offer grass and water to the carcass of an ox? And hereupon he spoke two stanzas. Why haste to bring thy new-mown grass so sweet? And cry to lifeless beast, Arise and eat? No food may raise to life an ox that's dead. Thy words are idle and of folly bred. Then the Bodhisattva uttered 2 stanzas. Methinks this beast may come to life again, both head and tail, and its 4 feet remain. But of my grandsire head and limbs are gone. No fool weeps o'er his grave but thou alone. On hearing this the father of the Bodhisattva thought, my son is wise. He knows the right thing to be done both for this world and for the next. He did this to console me. And he said, my dear and wise son Sujata, it is known to me that all existing things are impermanent. Henceforth I will not grieve. Such a son as this must be every one that would remove a father's grief. In singing the praises of his son he said, as ghee-fed flame that blazes out amain, is quenched with water, so he quenched my pain. With sorrow's shaft my heart was wounded sore. He healed the wound and did my life restore. The barb extracted full of peace and joy. I ceased to grieve and hearken to my boy. Thus kindly souls wean mortals from their grief. As wise Sujata brought his sire relief. The master having ended his discourse revealed the truths and identified the birth. At the conclusion of the truths the landowner attained fruition of the first path. At that time I myself was Sujata. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 353. Dhonasakha Jataka. Though thou art now, etc. This story the master, while living in the Bisakala Grove near some Samarajari Mount Crocodile, in the country of the Bagas, told concerning young Prince Bodhi. This prince was the son of Udina, and at this time dwelt in some Samarajari. Now he summoned a very skillful artisan, and got him to build him a palace called Kakinada, and to make it unlike that of any other king. And afterwards he thought, this artisan may build a similar palace for some other king. And from a feeling of envy he plucked out his eyes. This circumstance became known in the assembly of the brethren. Then they raised a discussion in the hall of truth, saying, sirs, young Prince Bodhi had the eyes of such and such an artisan put out. Surely he is a harsh, cruel, and violent man. The master came and asked what was the topic the brethren were debating as they sat together. And hearing what it was he said, not now only, but formerly too such was his nature. And of old in like manner he put out the eyes of 1,000 warriors and after slaying them, he offered up their flesh as a religious sacrifice. And so saying he told them a story of past times. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, the Bodhisattva became a world-renowned teacher at Tacasara, and youths of the warrior and Brahmin castes came from all India to be taught the arts by him. The son of the king of Benares too, Prince Brahmadatta, was taught the 3 Vedas by him. Now he was by nature harsh, cruel, and violent. The Bodhisattva, by his power of divination knowing his character, said, my friend, you are harsh, cruel, and violent, and verily power that is attained by a man of violence is short-lived. When his power is gone from him, he is like a ship that is wrecked at sea. He reaches no sure haven. Therefore be not of such a character. And by way of admonition he repeated 2 stanzas. Though thou art now with peace and plenty blessed, such happy fate may short-lived prove to be. Should riches perish, be not sore distressed. Like storm-tossed sailor wrecked far out at sea, each one shall fare according to his deed, and reap the harvest as he sows the seed, whether of goodly herb, or maybe noxious weed. Then he bade his teacher farewell, and returned to Benares, and after exhibiting his proficiency in the arts to his father, he was established in the viceroyalty, and on his father's death, he succeeded to the kingdom. His family priest, Panjiya by name, was a harsh and cruel man. Being greedy of fame he thought, what if I were to cause all the rulers of India to be seized by this king? And if he should thus become sole monarch and I become sole priest? And he got the king to hearken to his words. And the king marched forth with a great army, and invested the city of a certain king, and took him prisoner. And by similar means he gained the sovereignty of all India. And with 1,000 kings in his train, he went to seize upon the kingdom of Tacasara. The Bodhisattva repaired the walls of the city, and made it impregnable to its enemies. And the king of Benares had a canopy set up over him, and a curtain thrown round about him, at the foot of a big banyan tree on the banks of the Ganges. And having a couch spread for him, he took up his quarters there. Fighting in the plains of India, he had taken captive 1,000 kings, but failing in his attack on Tacasara, he asked his priest, "Master, though we have come hither with a host of captive kings, we cannot take Tacasara. What now are we to do?" "Great king," he answered, "put out the eyes of the 1,000 kings, and ripping open their bellies, let us take their flesh, and the 5 sweet substances, and make an offering to the guardian deity of this banyan. And surrounding the tree with a rimmed circumference, let us fill it with blood 5 inches deep. And so shall the victory soon be ours." The king readily assented, and concealing mighty wrestlers behind the curtain, he summoned each king separately. And when the wrestlers had squeezed them in their arms till they had reduced them to a state of insensibility, he had their eyes put out, and after they were dead, he took the flesh and caused the carcasses to be carried away by the Ganges. Then he made the offering, as described above, and had the drum beaten, and went forth to battle. Then came a certain Yaka from his watchtower, and tore out the right eye of the king. Severe pain set in, and maddened by the agony he suffered, he went and lay down at full length upon the couch prepared for him, at the foot of the banyan tree. At this moment a vulture took a sharp-pointed bone, and perched on the top of the tree. In eating the flesh it let drop the bone, and the sharp point falling as with iron spikes on the king's left eye, destroyed that eye too. At this moment he recalled the words of the Bodhisattva and said, "Our teacher, when he said, 'These mortals experience results corresponding to their deeds, even as fruit corresponds with the seed,' spoke, I suppose, with all this before his mind's eye. And in his lamentation he addressed Pangaea in 2 stanzas. Ah, now at last I recognize the truth. The master taught me in my heedless youth. Sin not, he cried, or else the evil deed to thine own punishment may one day lead. Beneath this tree's trim boughs and quivering shade, libation dew of sandal oil was made. 'Twas here I slew 1,000 kings, and lo, the pangs they suffered then, I now must undergo." Thus lamenting, he called to mind his queen consort, and repeated this stanza. "O Abari, my queen of swarthy hue, lithe as a shoot of fair morina tree, that dost thy limbs with sandal oil bedew, how should I live bereft of sight of thee? Yet death itself than this less grievous far would be." While he was still murmuring these words, he died and was born again in hell. The priest, so ambitious of power, could not save him, nor could he save himself by his own power. And as soon as he died, his army broke up and fled. The master, having ended his lesson, thus identified the birth. At that time the young Prince Bodhi was the marauding king, Devdutta was Pangaea, and I myself was the world-famed teacher. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankinipada. 354. Uraga Jataka. Man quits his mortal frame, etc. This story the master, while dwelling at Jetavana, told concerning a landowner whose son had died. The introductory story is just the same as that of the man who lost both his wife and father. Here too the master in the same way went to the man's house, and after saluting him as he was seated, asked him saying, "Pray, sir, are you grieving?" And on his replying, "Yes, reverend sir, ever since my son's death I grieve," he said, "Sir, verily that which is subject to dissolution is dissolved, and that which is subject to destruction is destroyed, and this happens not to one man only, nor in one village merely, but in countless spheres, And in the three modes of existence, there is no creature that is not subject to death, nor is there any existing thing that is capable of abiding in the same condition. All beings are subject to death, and all compounds are subject to dissolution. But sages of old, when they lost a son, said, "That which is subject to destruction is destroyed, and grieved not." And hereupon at the man's request he related a story of the past. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, the Bodhisattva was born in a Brahmin household, in a village outside the gates of Benares, and rearing a family he supported them by field labor. He had 2 children, a son and a daughter. When the son was grown up, the father brought a wife home for him from a family of equal rank with his own. Thus with a female slave they composed a household of 6, the Bodhisattva and his wife, the son and daughter, the daughter-in-law and the female slave. They lived happily and affectionately together. The Bodhisattva thus admonished the other 5. According as ye have received, give alms, observe holy days, keep the moral law, dwell on the thought of death, be mindful of your mortal state. For in the case of beings like ourselves, death is certain, life uncertain. All existing things are transitory and subject to decay. Therefore take heed to your ways day and night. They readily accepted his teaching, and dwelt earnestly on the thought of death. Now one day the Bodhisattva went with his son to plow his field. The son gathered together the rubbish and set fire to it. Not far from where he was, lived a snake in an anthill. The smoke hurt the snake's eyes. Coming out from his hole in a rage, it thought, "This is all due to that fellow." And fastening upon him with its 4 teeth it bit him. The youth fell down dead. The Bodhisattva, on seeing him fall, left his oxen and came to him, and finding that he was dead, he took him up and laid him at the foot of a certain tree, and covering him up with a cloak, he neither wept nor lamented. He said, "That which is subject to dissolution is dissolved, and that which is subject to death is dead. All compound existences are transitory and liable to death." And recognizing the transitory nature of things, he went on with his plowing. Seeing a neighbor pass close by the field, he asked, "Friend, are you going home?" And on his answering yes, he said, "Please then to go to our house and say to the mistress, 'You are not today as formerly to bring food for 2, but to bring it for 1 only. And hitherto the female slave alone has brought the food, but today all 4 of you are to put on clean garments, and to come with perfumes and flowers in your hands.'" "All right," he said, and went and spoke these very words to the Brahmin's wife. She asked, "By whom, sir, was this message given?" "By the Brahmin lady," he replied. Then she understood that her son was dead, but she did not so much as tremble. Thus showing perfect self-control, and wearing white garments and with perfumes and flowers in her hand, she bade them bring food, and accompanied the other members of the family to the field. But no one of them all either shed a tear or made lamentation. The Bodhisattva, still sitting in the shade where the youth lay, ate his food, and when his meal was finished, they all took up firewood, and lifting the body onto the funeral pile, they made offerings of perfumes and flowers, and then set fire to it. But not a single tear was shed by any one. All were dwelling on the thought of death. Such was the efficacy of their virtue, that the throne of Sakka manifested signs of heat. Sakka said, "Who, I wonder, is anxious to bring me down from my throne?" And on reflection he discovered that the heat was due to the force of virtue existing in these people. And being highly pleased he said, "I must go to them and utter a loud cry of exultation like the roaring of a lion, and immediately afterwards fill their dwelling place with the 7 treasures." And going there in haste he stood by the side of the funeral pyre and said, "What are you doing?" "We are burning the body of a man, my lord." "It is no man that you are burning," he said. "Methinks you are roasting the flesh of some beast that you have slain." "Not so, my lord," they said. "It is merely the body of a man that we are burning." Then he said, "It must have been some enemy." The Bodhisattva said, "It is our own true son, and no enemy." "Then he could not have been dear as a son to you." "He was very dear, my lord." "Then why do you not weep?" Then the Bodhisattva, to explain the reason why he did not weep, uttered the first stanza. "Man quits his mortal frame, when joy in life is past. E'en as a snake is wont its worn-out slough to cast. No friend's lament can touch the ashes of the dead. Why should I grieve? He fares the way he had to tread." Sakka, on hearing the words of the Bodhisattva, asked the Brahmin's wife. How, lady, did the dead man stand to you? I sheltered him 10 months in my womb, and suckled him at my breast, and directed the movements of his hands and feet, and he was my grown-up son, my lord. Granted, lady, that a father from the nature of a man may not weep. A mother's heart surely is tender. Why then do you not weep? And to explain why she did not weep, she uttered a couple of stanzas. Uncalled he hither came, unbidden soon to go. E'en as he came he went. What cause is here for woe? No friend's lament can touch the ashes of the dead. Why should I grieve? He fares the way he had to tread. On hearing the words of the Brahmin's wife, Saka asked the sister, Lady, what was the dead man to you? He was my brother, my lord. Lady, sisters surely are loving towards their brothers. Why do you not weep? But she, to explain the reason why she did not weep, repeated a couple of stanzas. Though I should fast and weep, how would it profit me? My kith and kin, alas, would more unhappy be. No friend's lament can touch the ashes of the dead. Why should I grieve? He fares the way he had to tread. Saka, on hearing the words of the sister, asked his wife, Lady, what was he to you? He was my husband, my lord. Women surely, when a husband dies, as widows are helpless. Why do you not weep? But she, to explain the reason why she did not weep, uttered 2 stanzas. As children cry in vain to grasp the moon above, so mortals idly mourn the loss of those they love. No friend's lament can touch the ashes of the dead. Why should I grieve? He fares the way he had to tread. Saka, on hearing the words of the wife, asked the handmaid, saying, Woman, what was he to you? He was my master, my lord. No doubt you must have been abused and beaten and oppressed by him, and therefore, thinking he is happily dead, you weep not. Speak not so, my lord. This does not suit his case. My young master was full of long suffering and love and pity for me, and was as a foster child to me. Then why do you not weep? And she, to explain why she did not weep, uttered a couple of stanzas. A broken pot of earth, ah, who can piece again? So too to mourn the dead is not but labor vain. No friend's lament can touch the ashes of the dead. Why should I grieve? He fares the way he had to tread. Saka, after hearing what they all had to say, was greatly pleased and said, Ye have carefully dwelt on the thought of death. Henceforth ye are not to labor with your own hands. I am Saka, king of heaven. I will create the 7 treasures in countless abundance in your house. Ye are to give alms, to keep the moral law, to observe holy days, and to take heed to your ways. And thus admonishing them, he filled their house with countless wealth, and so parted from them. The master, having finished his exposition of the law, declared the truths and identified the birth. At the conclusion of the truths, the landowner attained the fruit of the first path. At that time Khajjopanaka was the female slave, Uppalavana the daughter, Rahila the son, Hema the mother, and I myself was the Brahmin. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankanipada. 355, Ghata Jataka. While others weep, etc. This story the master, dwelling at Jetavana, told concerning a minister of the king of Kosala. The introductory story is identical with one already given. But in this case the king, after bestowing great honor on a minister who served him well, gave ear to certain mischief makers, and had him seized and thrown into prison. While he was lying there, he entered upon the first path. The king, becoming aware of his great merit, released him. He took a scented garland, and coming into the presence of the master, saluted him and sat down. Then the master asked if some evil had not befallen him. Yes, reverend sir, he answered. But through evil good has come to me. I have entered on the first path. Verily, said the master, not you only, but sages of old got good out of evil. And herewith at his request he told a story of the past. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, The Bodhisattva was born to him as the son of his queen consort, and they called him Prince Ghata. He afterwards acquired a knowledge of the arts at Tacasara and ruled his kingdom righteously. Now a certain minister misconduct himself in the royal harem. The king, after witnessing the offense with his own eyes, banished him from his kingdom. At that time a king named Venka ruled in Savatthi. The minister went to him, and entering his service, just as in the former story, gained the king's ear, and got him to seize on the kingdom of Benares. After gaining possession of the kingdom, he had the Bodhisattva bound in chains, and threw him into prison. The Bodhisattva entered on an ecstatic meditation, and sat cross-legged in the air. A burning heat sprang up in the body of Venka. He came and beheld the countenance of the Bodhisattva radiant with the beauty of a full-blown lotus, like to a golden mirror, and in the form of a question repeated the first stanza, while others weep and wail, their cheeks with tears bestained. Why still with smiling face has Ghata ne'er complained? Then the Bodhisattva, to explain why he did not grieve, recited the remaining stanzas. To change the past all sorrow is but vain. It has no blessing for a future state. Why should I, Venka, of my woes complain? Grief is no helpmeet fit with us to mate. One that is sick with sorrow pines away. His food insipid and distasteful grows. Pierced as with arrows, to his grief a prey, he sinks a laughing stock to all his foes. Whether my home be on dry land or sea, be it in village or some forest drear, no sorrow ever shall come nigh to me. A soul converted can have naught to fear. But he that lacks completion in himself, and is with lust of things of sense afire, not the whole world with all its sordid pelf, can e'er suffice for such a man's desire. Venka therefore, after hearing these 4 stanzas, asked forgiveness of the Bodhisattva, and restored him to his kingdom, and went his way. But the Bodhisattva handed over the kingdom to his ministers, and retreating to the Himalayas became an ascetic, and without any break in his ecstatic meditation, was destined to birth in the world of Brahma. The master, having ended his lesson, identified the birth. At that time Ananda was King Venka, and I myself was King Ghata. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 356. Karandiya Jataka. Why in forest? Etc. This was a story told by the master while dwelling at Jetavana, concerning the captain of the faith Sariputta. That elder, they say, when wicked folk came to him, such as hunters, fishermen and the like, laid down the moral law to them, and any others that he might see from time to time, saying, Receive ye the law. Through respect for the elder, they could not disobey his words and accepted the law, but failed to keep it, and still followed each after his own business. The elder took counsel with his fellow priests and said, Sirs, these men received the law from me, but keep it not. They answered, Holy sir, you preach the law to them against their wishes, and as they dare not disobey what you tell them, they accept it. Henceforth lay not down the law to such as these. The elder was offended. On hearing of the incident, they started a discussion in the Hall of Truth, how that the elder Sariputta preached the law to any that he happened to see. The master came and inquired what was the topic that the brethren were debating in their assembly, and on hearing what it was he said, Not now only, brethren, but formerly also he preached the law to any men he might chance to see, even though they did not ask for it. And herewith he told a story of the past. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta reigned in Benares, the Bodhisattva was born and grew up in a Brahmin household, and became the chief pupil of a world-famed teacher at Tacasara. At that time this teacher preached the moral law to anyone that he might see, fishermen and the like, even if they did not want it, repeatedly bidding them receive the law. But though they received it, they kept it not. The teacher spoke of it to his disciples. His disciples said, Holy sir, you preach to them against their wishes, and therefore they break the law. Henceforth preach only to those who wish to hear you, and not to those who do not wish. The teacher was filled with regret, but even so he still laid down the law to all whom he happened to see. Now one day some people came from a certain village and invited the teacher to partake of the cakes offered to Brahmins. He summoned his disciple named Karandiya and said, "My dear son, I am not going, but you are to go there with these 500 disciples and receive the cakes and bring the portion that falls to my share." So he sent him. The disciple went, and as he was returning, he spied on the road a cave, and the thought struck him, "Our master lays down the law, without being asked, to all that he sees. Henceforth I will cause him to preach only to those that wish to hear him." And while the other disciples were comfortably seated, he arose and picking up a huge stone, flung it into the cave, and again repeated the action. Then the disciples stood up and said, "Sir, what are you doing?" Karandiya said not a word, and they went in haste and told their master. The master came and in conversing with Karandiya repeated the first stanza, "Why in forest all alone, seizing oft a mighty stone, didst thou hurl it with a will, mountain cave as 'twere to fill?" On hearing his words, Karandiya to rouse his master uttered the second stanza, "I would make this sea-girt land smooth as palm of human hand, thus I level knoll and hill, and with stones each hollow fill." The Brahmin on hearing this repeated the third stanza, "Ne'er a one of mortal birth has the power to level earth, scarce Karandiya can hope with a single cave to cope." The disciple on hearing this spoke the fourth stanza, "If a man of mortal birth has no power to level earth, heretics may well refuse, Brahmin, to adopt thy views." On hearing this the teacher made an appropriate reply, for he now recognized that other men might differ from him, and thinking, "I will no longer act thus," he uttered the fifth stanza, "Friend Karandiya, in short, for my good thou dost exhort, earth can never leveled be, neither can all men agree." Thus did the teacher sing the praises of his disciple, and he, after he had thus admonished his teacher, conducted him home. The master, having ended this lesson, identified the birth. At that time Sariputta was the Brahmin, and I myself was the disciple Karandiya. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 357, Latukika Jataka. Elephant of 60 years, etc. This was a story told by the master while dwelling in the bamboo grove, concerning Devdatta. One day they raised a discussion in the Hall of Truth, saying, "Sirs, Devdatta is harsh, cruel, and violent. He has not an atom of pity for mortals." When the master came, he inquired what was the topic the brethren were assembled to discuss. And on hearing what it was, he said, "Brethren, not now only, but formerly also he was pitiless." And herewith he told a story of the past. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, the Bodhisattva came to life as a young elephant, and growing up a fine comely beast, he became the leader of the herd, with a following of 80,000 elephants, and dwelt in the Himalayas. At that time a quail laid her eggs in the feeding ground of the elephants. When the eggs were ready to be hatched, the young birds broke the shells and came out, before their wings had grown. And when they were still unable to fly, the great being with his following of 80,000 elephants, in ranging about for food, came to this spot. On seeing them the quail thought, "This royal elephant will trample on my young ones and kill them. Lo, I will implore his righteous protection for the defense of my brood." Then she raised her 2 wings, and standing before him repeated the first stanza, "Elephant of 60 years, forest lord amongst thy peers, I am but a puny bird, thou a leader of the herd. With my wings I homage pay, spare my little ones I pray." The great being said, "O quail, be not troubled, I will protect thy offspring." And standing over the young birds, while the 80,000 elephants passed by, he thus addressed the quail, "Behind us comes a solitary rogue elephant. He will not do our bidding. When he comes, do thou entreat him too, and so ensure the safety of thy offspring." And with these words he made off. And the quail went forth to meet the other elephant, and with both wings uplifted, making respectful salutation, she spoke the second stanza, roaming over hill and dale, cherishing thy lonely way. Thee, O forest king, I hail, and with wings my homage pay. I am but a wretched quail, spare my tender brood to slay. On hearing her words, the elephant spoke the third stanza. I will slay thy young ones, quail. What can thy poor help avail? My left foot can crush with ease many thousand birds like these. And so saying, with his foot he crushed the young birds to atoms, and sailing over them washed them away in a flood of water, and went off loudly trumpeting. The quail sat down on the bough of a tree and said, Then be off with you and trumpet away. You shall very soon see what I will do. You little know what a difference there is between strength of body and strength of mind. Well, I will teach you this lesson. And thus threatening him, she repeated the fourth stanza. Power abused is not all gain. Power is often folly's bane. Beast that didst my young ones kill, I will work thee mischief still. And so saying, shortly afterward she did a good turn to a crow. And when the crow, who was highly pleased, asked, What can I do for you? The quail said, There is nothing else, sir, to be done, but I shall expect you to strike with your beak, and to peck out the eyes of this rogue elephant. The crow readily assented, and the quail then did a service to a blue fly. And when the fly asked, What can I do for you? She said, When the eyes of this rogue elephant have been put out by the crow, then I want you to let fall a nit upon them. The fly agreed, and then the quail did a kindness to a frog, and when the frog asked what it was to do, she said, When this rogue elephant becomes blind, and shall be searching for water to drink, then take your stand and utter a croak on the top of a mountain, and when he has climbed to the top, come down and croak again at the bottom of the precipice. This much I shall look for at your hands. After hearing what the quail said, the frog readily assented. So one day the crow with its beak pecked out both the eyes of the elephant, and the fly dropped its eggs upon them. And the elephant, being eaten up with maggots, was maddened by the pain, and overcome with thirst wandered about seeking for water to drink. At this moment the frog, standing on the top of a mountain, uttered a croak. Thought the elephant, There must be water there, and climbed up the mountain. Then the frog descended, and standing at the bottom croaked again. The elephant thought, There will be water there, and moved forward towards the precipice, and rolling over fell to the bottom of the mountain, and was killed. When the quail knew that the elephant was dead, she said, I have seen the back of mine enemy, and in a high state of delight strutted over his body, and passed away to fare according to her deeds. The master said, Brethren, one ought not to incur the hostility of anyone. These four creatures, by combining together, brought about the destruction of this elephant, strong as he was. A quail with crow, blue fly and frog allied, once proved the issue of a deadly feud. Through them King Elephant untimely died. Therefore all quarreling should be eschewed. Uttering this stanza inspired by perfect wisdom, he thus identified the birth. At that time Devdutta was the rogue elephant, and I myself was the leader of the herd of elephants. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankinipada. 358. Culladhammapala Jataka. Mahapatapa's Wretched Queen, etc. This story the master, when dwelling north the bamboo grove, told concerning the going about of Devdutta to slay the Bodhisattva. In all other births Devdutta failed to excite so much as an atom of fear in the Bodhisattva. But in the Culladhammapala birth, when the Bodhisattva was only 7 months old, he had his hands and feet, and head cut off, and his body encircled with sword cuts, as it were with a garland. In the Dadara birth he killed him by twisting his neck, and roasted his flesh in an oven and ate it. In the Kantavadi birth he had him scourged with 2,000 strokes of a whip, and ordered his hands and feet and ears and nose to be cut off, and then had him seized by the hair of his head and dragged along. And when he was stretched at full length on his back, he kicked him in the belly and made off. And that very day the Bodhisattva died. But both in the Culladhanuggaha and the Vaivadyakapi births, he merely had him put to death. Thus did Devdutta for a long time go about to slay him, and continued to do so, even after he became a Buddha. So one day they raised a discussion in the Hall of Truth, saying, "Sirs, Devdutta is continually forming plots to slay the Buddhas. Being minded to kill the Supreme Buddha, he suborned archers to shoot him. He threw down a rock upon him, and let loose the elephant Nalajirai on him." When the master came and inquired what subject the brethren were assembled to discuss, on hearing what it was he said, "Brethren, not now only, but formerly too he went about to kill me, but now he fails to excite a particle of fear in me. Though formerly when I was Prince Dhammapala he brought about my death, though I was his own son, by encircling my body with sword cuts, as it were with a garland." And so saying he related a story of the past. Once upon a time when Mahapatapa was reigning in Benares, the Bodhisattva came to life as the son of his queen consort Kanda, and they named him Dhammapala. When he was 7 months old, his mother had him bathed in scented water, and richly dressed and sat playing with him. The king came to the place of her abode, and as she was playing with the boy, being filled with a mother's love for her child, she omitted to rise up on seeing the king. He thought, "Even now this woman is filled with pride on account of her boy, and does not value me a straw, but as the boy grows up, she will think, I have a man for my son, and will take no notice of me. I will have him put to death at once." So he returned home, and sitting on his throne summoned the executioner into his presence, with all the instruments of his office. The man put on his yellow robe and wearing a crimson wreath laid his axe upon his shoulder, and carrying a block and a bowl in his hands, came and stood before the king, and saluting him said, "What is your pleasure, sire?" "Go to the royal closet of the queen, and bring hither Dhammapala," said the king. But the queen knew that the king had left her in a rage, and laid the Bodhisattva on her bosom and sat weeping. The executioner came, and giving her a blow in the back snatched the boy out of her arms, and took him to the king and said, "What is your pleasure, sire?" The king had a board brought, and put down before him, and said, "Lay him down on it." The man did so. But Queen Kanda came, and stood just behind her son weeping. Again the executioner said, "What is your pleasure, sire?" "Cut off Dhammapala's hands," said the king. Queen Kanda said, "Great king, my boy is only a child 7 months old. He knows nothing. The fault is not his. If there be any fault it is mine. Therefore bid my hands to be cut off." And to make her meaning clear, she uttered the first stanza, "Mahapatapa's wretched queen, 'tis I alone to blame have been. Bid Dhammapala sire go free, and off with hands of luckless me." The king looked at the executioner. "What is your pleasure, sire?" "Without further delay, off with his hands," said the king. At this moment the executioner took a sharp axe, and lopped off the boy's 2 hands, as if they had been young bamboo shoots. The boy, when his hands were cut off, neither wept nor lamented, but moved by patience and charity bore it with resignation. But the Queen Kanda put the tips of his fingers in her lap, and stained with blood went about lamenting. Again the executioner asked, "What is your pleasure, sire?" "Off with his feet," said the king. On hearing this, Kanda uttered the second stanza, "Mahapatapa's wretched queen, 'tis I alone to blame have been. Bid Dhammapala sire go free, and off with feet of luckless me." But the king gave a sign to the executioner, and he cut off both his feet. Queen Kanda put his feet also in her lap, and stained with blood, lamented and said, "My lord Mahapatapa, his feet and hands are cut off. A mother is bound to support her children. I will work for wages and support my son. Give him to me." The executioner said, "Sire, is the king's pleasure fulfilled? Is my service finished?" "Not yet," said the king. "What then is your pleasure, sire?" "Off with his head," said the king. Then Kanda repeated the third stanza, "Mahapatapa's wretched queen, 'tis I alone to blame have been. Bid Dhammapala sire go free, and off with head of luckless me." And with these words she offered her own head. Again the executioner asked, "What is your pleasure, sire?" "Off with his head," said the king. So he cut off his head and asked, "Is the king's pleasure fulfilled?" "Not yet," said the king. "What further am I to do, sire?" "Catching him with the edge of the sword," said the king. "Encircle him with sword cuts as it were with a garland." Then he threw the body of the boy up into the air, and catching it with the edge of his sword, encircled him with sword cuts, as it were with a garland, and scattered the bits on the dais. Kanda placed the flesh of the Bodhisattva in her lap, and as she sat on the dais lamenting, she repeated these stanzas. No friendly counselors advised the king. Slay not the heir that from thy loins did spring. No loving kinsman urged the tender plea. Slay not the boy that owes his life to thee. Moreover, after speaking these two stanzas, Queen Kanda, pressing both her hands upon her heart, repeated the third stanza. Thou, Dhammapala, wert by right of birth the lord of earth. Thy arms, once bathed in oil of sandalwood, lie steeped in blood. My fitful breath, alas, is choked with sighs and broken cries. While she was thus lamenting, her heart broke, as a bamboo snaps when the grove is on fire, and she fell dead on the spot. The king too, being unable to remain on his throne, fell down on the dais. An abyss was cleft asunder in the ground, and straightway he fell into it. Then the solid earth, though many myriads more than 200,000 leagues in thickness, being unable to bear with his wickedness, clave asunder and opened a chasm. A flame arose out of the Avicii hell, and seizing upon him, wrapped him about, as with a royal woolen garment, and plunged him into Avicii. His ministers performed the funeral rites of Kanda and the Bodhisattva. The master, having brought this discourse to an end, identified the birth. At that time Devdutta was the king, Mahapajapati was Kanda, and I myself was Prince Dhammapala. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 359. Suvannamiga Jataka. O Golden Foot. This was a story told by the master while in residence at Jetavana, about a maiden of gentle birth in Savatthi. She was, they say, the daughter in the household of a servitor of the two chief disciples at Savatthi, and was a faithful believer, fondly attached to Buddha, the law, and the church, abounding in good works, wise unto salvation, and devoted to almsgiving and such like deeds of piety. Another family in Savatthi of equal rank, but of heretical views, chose her in marriage. Then her parents said, Our daughter is a faithful believer, devoted to the three treasures, given to alms and other good works, but you hold heretical views. And as you will not allow her to give alms, or to hear the truth, or to visit the monastery, or to keep the moral law, or to observe holy days, as she pleases, we will not give her to you in marriage. Choose ye a maiden from a family of heretical views like yourselves. When their offer was rejected, they said, Let your daughter, when she comes to our house, do everything of this kind, as she pleases. We will not prevent her. Only grant us this boon. Take her then, they answered. So they celebrated the marriage festivity at an auspicious season, and led her home. She proved faithful in the discharge of her duties, and a devoted wife, and rendered due service to her father-in-law and mother-in-law. One day she said to her husband, I wish, my lord, to give alms to our family priests. Very well, my dear, give them just what you please. So one day she invited these priests, and making a great entertainment, she fed them with choice food, and taking a seat apart from them she said, Holy sirs, this family is heretical and unbelieving. They are ignorant of the value of the three treasures. Well then, sirs, until this family understands the value of the three treasures, do you continue to receive your food here? The priests assented, and continually ate their meals there. Again she addressed her husband, Sir, the priests constantly come here. Why do you not see them? On hearing this he said, Very well, I will see them. On the morrow she told him when the priests had finished their meal. He came and sat respectfully on one side, conversing affably with the priests. Then the captain of the faith preached the law to him. He was so charmed with the exposition of the faith, and the deportment of the priests, that from that day forward he prepared mats for the elders to sit on, and strained water for them, and during the meal listened to the exposition of the faith. By and by his heretical views gave way. So one day the elder, in expounding the faith, declared the truths to the man and his wife, and when the sermon was ended, they were both established in the fruition of the first path. Thenceforth all of them, from his parents down to the hired servants, gave up their heretical views, and became devoted to the Buddha, his law, and the church. So one day this young girl said to her husband, "What, sir, have I to do with the household life? I wish to adopt the religious life." "Very well, my dear," he said. "I too will become an ascetic." And he conducted her with great pomp to a sisterhood, and had her admitted as a novice, and himself too went to the master and begged to be ordained. The master admitted him first to deacons, and afterwards to priests' orders. They both received clear spiritual vision, and shortly attained to sainthood. One day they raised a discussion in the Hall of Truth, saying, "Sirs, a certain woman by reason of her own faith, and that of her husband became a novice, and both of them having adopted the religious life, and gained clear spiritual vision, attained to sainthood." The master, when he came, inquired what was the topic the brethren were sitting in council to discuss, and on hearing what it was he said, "Brethren, not now only did she set her husband free from the bonds of passion, formerly too she freed even sages of old from the bonds of death." And with these words he held his peace, but being pressed by them he related a story of the past. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, the Bodhisattva came to life as a young stag, and grew up a beautiful and graceful creature, of the color of gold. His fore and hind feet were covered, as it were, with a preparation of lac. His horns were like a silver wreath, his eyes resembled round jewels, and his mouth was like a ball of crimson wool. The doe that was his mate was also a handsome creature, and they lived happily and harmoniously together. 8 myriads of dappled deer followed in the train of the Bodhisattva. While they were thus living there, a certain hunter set a snare in the deer drives. So one day the Bodhisattva, while leading his herd, entangled his foot in the snare, and thinking to break the noose he tugged at it, and cut the skin of his foot. Again he tugged it, and hurt the flesh, and a third time and injured the tendon, and the noose penetrated to the very bone. Not being able to break the snare, the stag was so alarmed with the fear of death, that he uttered a succession of cries. On hearing it the herd of deer fled in a panic. But the doe, as she fled, looking amongst the deer, missed the Bodhisattva, and thought, "This panic must certainly have something to do with my lord," and flying in haste to him, with many tears and lamentations she said, "My lord, you are very strong. Why can you not get the better of the snare? Put forth your strength and break it." And thus stirring him up to make an effort, she uttered the first stanza, "O golden foot, no effort spare, to loose thyself from thong's snare. How could I joy bereft of thee, to range amidst the woodland free?" The Bodhisattva, on hearing this, responded in a second stanza, "I spare no effort, but in vain. My liberty I cannot gain. The more I struggle to get loose, the sharper bites the thong noose." Then the doe said, "My lord, fear not. By my own power will I entreat the hunter, and by giving up my own life, I will gain yours in exchange." And thus comforting the great being, she continued to embrace the blood-stained Bodhisattva. But the hunter approached, with sword and spear in hand, like to the destroying flame at the beginning of a cycle. On seeing him the doe said, "My lord, the hunter is coming. By my own power I will rescue you. Be not afraid." And thus comforting the stag, she went to meet the hunter, and standing at a respectful distance, she saluted him and said, "My lord, my husband is of the color of gold, and endued with all the virtues, the king of 8 myriads of deer." And thus singing the praises of the Bodhisattva, she begged for her own death, if only the king of the herd might remain intact. And she repeated the third stanza, "Let on the earth a leafy bed, hunter, where we may fall be spread, and drawing from its sheath thy sword, slay me and afterwards my lord." The hunter, on hearing this, was struck with amazement and said, "Even human beings give not up their lives for their king, much less the beasts. What can this mean? This creature speaks with a sweet voice in the language of men. This day will I grant life to her and to her mate." And greatly charmed with her, the hunter uttered the fourth stanza, "A beast that speaks with voice of men, ne'er came before within my ken. Rest thou in peace, my gentle deer, and cease, O golden foot, to fear." The doe, seeing the Bodhisattva set at his ease, was highly delighted, and returning thanks to the hunter, repeated the fifth stanza, "As I today rejoice to see this mighty beast at liberty, so hunter that didst loose the jinn, rejoice with all thy kith and kin." And the Bodhisattva thought, This hunter has granted life to me and this doe, and to 8 myriads of deer. He has been my refuge, and I ought to be a refuge to him. And in his character of one supremely virtuous he thought, one ought to make a proper return to one's benefactor. And he gave the hunter a magic jewel, which he had found in their feeding ground, and said, Friend, henceforth take not the life of any creature, but with this jewel set up a household, and maintain a wife and children, and give alms and do other good works. And thus admonishing him, the stag disappeared in the forest. The master here ended his lesson and identified the birth. At that time Channa was the hunter, this female novice was the doe, and I myself was the royal stag. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 360, Sussondi Jataka. I sent the fragrance, etc. This story the master, while living at Jetavana, told concerning a backsliding brother. The master asked if it were true that he longed for the world, and what he had seen to make him regret having taken orders. The brother answered, it was all owing to the charms of a woman. The master said, Verily, brother, there is no possibility of being on one's guard against womenfolk. Sages of old, though they took the precaution to dwell in the abode of the Garudas, failed to be on their guard against them. And being urged by him, the master related a story of the past. Once upon a time King Tamba reigned in Benares, and his queen consort named Sussondi was a woman of surpassing beauty. At that time the Bodhisattva came to life as a young Garuda. Now the Naga island was then known as Saruma Island, and the Bodhisattva lived on this island in the abode of the Garudas. And he went to Benares, disguised as a youth, and played at dice with King Tamba. Remarking his beauty they said to Sussondi, such and such a youth plays at dice with our king. She longed to see him, and one day she adorned herself, and repaired to the dice chamber. There taking her stand amongst the attendants, she fixed her gaze on the youth. He too gazed on the queen, and the pair fell in love with one another. The Garuda king, by an act of supernatural power, stirred up a storm in the city. The people, through fear of the house falling, fled out of the palace. By his power he caused it to be dark, and carrying off the queen with him in the air, he made his way to his own abode in Naga Island. But no one knew of the coming or going of Sussondi. The Garuda took his pleasure with her, and still came to play at dice with the king. Now the king had a minstrel named Saga, and not knowing where the queen had gone, the king addressed the minstrel and said, Go now and explore every land and sea, and discover what has become of the queen. And so saying he bade him begone. He took what was necessary for his journey, and beginning the search from the city gate, at last came to Barakacha. At that time certain merchants of Barakacha were setting sail for the Golden Land. He approached them and said, I am a minstrel. If you remit my passage money, I will act as your minstrel. Take me with you. They agreed to do so, and putting him on board weighed anchor. When the ship was fairly off, they called him and bade him make music for them. He said, I would make music, but if I do, the fish will be so excited that your vessel will be wrecked. If a mere mortal, they said, make music, there will be no excitement on the part of the fish. Play to us. Then do not be angry with me, he said, and tuning his lute and keeping perfect harmony between the words of his song and the accompaniment of the lute string, he made music for them. The fish were maddened at the sound and splashed about. And a certain sea monster leaping up fell upon the ship, and broke it in two. Saga lying on a plank was carried along by the wind, till he reached a banyan tree in the Naga Island, where the Garuda king lived. Now Queen Sussondi, whenever the Garuda king went to play at dice, came down from her place of abode, and as she was wandering on the edge of the shore, she saw and recognized the minstrel Saga, and asked him how he got there. He told her the whole story, and she comforted him and said, Do not be afraid. And embracing him in her arms, she carried him to her abode and laid him on a couch. And when he was greatly revived, she fed him with heavenly food, bathed him in heavenly scented water, arrayed him in heavenly raiment, and adorned him with flowers of heavenly perfume, and made him recline upon a heavenly couch. Thus did she watch over him, and whenever the Garuda king returned, she hid her lover. And so soon as the king was gone, under the influence of passion she took her pleasure with him. At the end of a month and a half from that time some merchants, who dwelt at Benares, landed at the foot of the banyan tree in this island, to get fire, wood and water. The minstrel went on board ship with them, and on reaching Benares, as soon as he saw the king, while he was playing at dice, Saga took his lute, and making music recited the first stanza. I scent the fragrance of the Timara grove. I hear the moaning of the weary sea. Tamba, I am tormented with my love, for fair Sussondi dwells afar from me. On hearing this the Garuda king uttered the second stanza. How didst thou cross the stormy main, and Sarima in safety gain? How didst thou, Saga, tell me pray, to fair Sussondi win thy way? Then Saga repeated 3 stanzas, with trading folk from Barakacha land. My ship was wrecked by monsters of the sea. I on a plank did safely gain the strand, when an anointed queen with gentle hand upbore me tenderly upon her knee, as though to her a true son I might be. She food and raiment brought, and as I lay, with love-lorn eyes hung o'er my couch all day. No Tamba, well this word is sooth I say. The Garuda, while the minstrel thus spake, was filled with regrets and said, though I dwelt in the abode of the Garudas, I failed to guard her safely. What is this wicked woman to me? So he brought her back, and presented her to the king and departed. And thenceforth he came not there any more. The master, his lesson ended, declared the truths and identified the birth. At the conclusion of the truths the worldly-minded brother attained fruition of the first path. At that time Ananda was the king of Benares, and I myself was the Garuda king. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 361, Vannaroha Jataka. Is it thus, Siddhartha? Etc. This story the master, while dwelling at Jetavana, told concerning the 2 chief disciples. On a certain occasion the 2 chief elders resolved, during the rainy season, to devote themselves to solitude. So they bade the master farewell, and leaving the company of the brethren, they went forth from Jetavana, carrying their bowl and robes with their own hands, and lived in a forest near a border village. And a certain man, who waited on the elders, and lived upon their broken victuals, dwelt apart in the same place. On seeing how happily these elders lived together he thought, I wonder if it is possible to set them at variance. So he drew nigh to Sariputta and said, Can it be, reverend sir, that there is some quarrel between you and the venerable chief elder Moggallana? Why so, sir? He asked. He ever, holy sir, speaks in your dispraise and says, when I am gone, what is Sariputta worth compared with me in caste, lineage, family and country, or in the power of attainments in the sacred volumes? The elder smiled and said, Be off, Sara. Another day he drew nigh to the chief elder Moggallana, and said the same thing. He too smiled and said, Be off, Sara. Moggallana went to Sariputta and asked, Has this fellow, who lives on our leaving, said aught to you? Yes, friend, he has. And he said exactly the same thing to me. We must drive him away. Very well, friend, drive him away. The elder said, You are not to come here. And snapping his fingers at him, he drove him away. The 2 elders lived happily together, and returning to the master, made obeisance to him and sat down. The master spoke kindly to them, and asked if they had kept their retreat pleasantly. They said, A certain beggar wished to set us at variance, but failing in the attempt he ran away. The master said, Verily, Sariputta, not now only but formerly also, he thought to set you at variance, but failing in the attempt he ran away. And hereupon at his request he related a story of bygone days. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, the Bodhisattva was a tree god in a forest. At that time a lion and a tiger lived in a mountain cave in that forest. A jackal was in attendance on them, and living on their broken meats began to wax gross of body. And one day he was struck with the thought, I have never yet eaten the flesh of a lion or a tiger. I must set these 2 animals by the ears, and when in consequence of their quarrel they have come by their death, I will eat their flesh. So he drew nigh to the lion and said, "Is there any quarrel, sir, between you and the tiger?" "Why so, sir?" "Your reverence," he said, "he ever speaks in your dispraise and says, 'When I am gone, this lion will never attain to the 16th part of my personal beauty, nor of my stature and girth, nor of my natural strength and power.'" Then the lion said to him, "Off with you. He will never speak thus of me." Then the jackal drew nigh to the tiger also, and spoke after the same manner. On hearing him, the tiger hastened to the lion, and asked, "Friend, is it true that you said so and so of me?" And he spoke the first stanza. "Is it thus Siddhartha speaks of me? In grace of form and pedigree, in might and prowess in the field, Sabaha still to me must yield." On hearing this, Siddhartha repeated the 4 remaining stanzas. "Is it thus Sabaha speaks of me? In grace of form and pedigree, in might and prowess in the field, Siddhartha still to me must yield. If such injurious words are thine, no more shalt thou be friend of mine. The man that lends a ready ear to any gossip he may hear, soon picks a quarrel with a friend, and love and bitter hate will end. No friend suspects without a cause, or carefully looks out for flaws, but on his friend in trust will rest, as child upon its mother's breast, and ne'er will by a stranger's word be parted from his bosom's lord." When the qualities of a friend had been thus set forth in these 4 stanzas, the tiger said, "The fault is mine," and begged pardon of the lion. And they continued to live happily together in the same place. But the jackal departed and fled elsewhere. The master, having brought his lesson to an end, identified the birth. At that time the jackal was the beggar who lived on broken meats, the lion was Sariputta, the tiger Moggallana, and the deity that dwelt in that forest and saw the whole thing with his own eyes was I myself. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 362. Silavimamsa Jataka. Virtue and Learning, etc. This story the master, while residing at Jetavana, told concerning a Brahmin who would test the power of virtue. The king, they say, owing to his reputation for virtue, regarded him with special honor, beyond what was paid to other Brahmins. He thought, "Can it be that the king regards me with special honor, because I am endowed with virtue, or as one devoted to the acquisition of learning? I will just test the comparative importance of virtue and learning." So one day he abstracted a coin from the royal treasury board. The treasurer, such was his respect for him, did not say a word. It occurred a second time, and the treasurer said nothing. But on the third occasion he had him arrested as one who lived by robbery, and brought him before the king. And when the king asked what his offense was, he charged him with stealing the king's property. "Is this true, Brahmin?" said the king. "I am not in the habit of stealing your property, sire," he said. "But I had my doubts as to the relative importance of virtue and learning, and in testing which was the greater of the two, I thrice abstracted a coin, and then I was given into custody and brought before you. Now that I know the greater efficacy of virtue compared with learning, I no longer wish to live a layman's life. I will become an ascetic." On obtaining leave to do so, without so much as looking back on his house door, he went straight to Jetavana, and begged the master to ordain him. The master granted him both deacons and priests' orders, and he had been no long time in orders before he attained to spiritual insight and reached the highest fruition. The incident was discussed in the Hall of Truth, how that a certain Brahmin, after proving the power of virtue, took orders and obtaining spiritual insight reached sainthood. When the master came and inquired of the brethren what was the nature of the topic they were sitting to discuss, on hearing what it was, he said, "Not this man now only, but sages of old also put virtue to the proof, and by becoming ascetics worked out their own salvation." And herewith he told a story of the past. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, the Bodhisattva was born in a Brahmin family, and when he came of age, he acquired every liberal art at Tacasila, and on his return to Benares he went to see the king. The king offered him the post of family priest, and as he kept the 5 moral precepts, the king looked upon him with respect as a virtuous man. "Can it be," he thought, that the king regards me with respect as a virtuous man, or as one devoted to the acquisition of learning? And the whole story corresponds exactly with the modern instance. But in this case the Brahmin said, "Now I know the great importance of virtue compared with learning." And hereupon he spoke these 5 stanzas. Virtue and learning I was fain to test. Henceforth I doubt not virtue is the best. Virtue excels vain gifts of form and birth. Apart from virtue learning has no worth. A prince or peasant if to sin enslaved, in neither world front misery is saved. Men of high caste with those of base degree, if virtue is here, in heaven will equal be. Not birth nor lore, nor friendship aught avails. Pure virtue only future bliss entails. Thus did the great being sing the praises of virtue, and having gained the consent of the king, that very day he betook himself to the Himalaya region, and adopting the religious life of an ascetic, he developed the faculties and attainments, and became destined to birth in the Brahma world. The master here ended this lesson, and identified the birth. At that time it was I myself that put virtue to the test, and adopted the religious life of an ascetic. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 363, Hiri Jataka. Whose spite of honor, etc. This story the master, when dwelling at Jetavana, told concerning a rich merchant, a friend of Anathapindika, who lived in a border province. Both the introductory story and the story of the past are related in full in the concluding birth of the 9th division of the first book. But in this version, when the merchant of Benares was told that the followers of the foreign merchant were mulcted of all their property, and, after losing everything they possessed, had to take to flight, he said, because they failed to do what they ought for the strangers who came to them, they find no one ready to do them a good turn. And so saying he repeated these verses, whose spite of honor, while he plays the part of humble servant, loathes thee in his heart, poor in good works and rich in words alone. Ah, such a friend thou surely wouldst not own. Be thou indeed to every promise true, refuse to promise what thou canst not do. Wise men on empty braggarts look askew. No friend suspects a quarrel without cause, for ever watching to discover flaws. But he that trustful on a friend can rest, as little child upon its mother's breast, will ne'er by any stranger's deed or word be separated from his bosom's lord, who draws the yoke of human friendship well, of bliss increased and honored life can tell. But one that tastes the joys of calm repose, drinking sweet draughts of truth, he only knows escape from bonds of sin and all his woes. Thus did the great being, disgusted by coming into contact with evil associates, through the power of solitude, bring his teaching to a climax and lead men to the eternal nirvana. The master, his lesson ended, thus identified the birth. At that time I myself was the merchant of Benares. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 364, Khajjopanaka Jataka. This question about a firefly will be set forth in full in the Mahamagga. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 365, Ahigundiya Jataka. Lo, here we lie, etc. This story the master, whilst living at Jetavana, told concerning an aged priest. The story has been already related in full in the Salaka birth. In this version also the old man, after ordaining a village lad, abuses and strikes him. The lad escaped and returned to the world. The old man once more admitted him to orders, and acted just as before. The youth, after he had for the 3rd time returned to the world, on being again solicited to come back, would not so much as look the old man in the face. The matter was talked over in the Hall of Truth, how that a certain elder could live neither with his novice nor without him, while the boy, after seeing the old man's fault of temper, being a sensitive youth, would not even look at him. The master came, and asked what was the subject of discussion. When they told him, he said, "Not now only, brethren, but formerly also this same youth was a sensitive novice, who after observing the elder's faults would not so much as look at him." And so saying he told a story of the past. Once upon a time in the reign of Brahmadatta, king of Benares, The Bodhisattva was born in a corn factor's family. And when he was grown up, he got his living by selling corn. Now a certain snake charmer caught a monkey, and trained him to play with the snake. And when a festival was proclaimed at Benares, he left the monkey with the corn merchant, and roamed about for 7 days, making sport with the snake. The merchant meanwhile fed the monkey with food both hard and soft. On the 7th day the snake charmer got drunk at the festival merrymaking, and came back and struck the monkey 3 times with a piece of bamboo. And then taking him with him to a garden, he tied him up and fell asleep. The monkey got loose from his chain, and climbing up a mango tree, sat there eating the fruit. The snake charmer on waking up saw the monkey perched on the tree and thought, "I must catch him by wheedling him." And in talking with him he repeated the first stanza. "Lo, here we lie, my pretty one, like gambler by the dice undone. Let fall some mangoes, well we know, our living to thy tricks we owe." The monkey on hearing this, uttered the remaining verses. "Thy praises, friend, unmeaning sound. A pretty monkey ne'er was found, who in the stores when drunk I pray, did starve and beat me sore today. When I snake charmer call to mind, the bed of pain where I reclined, though I should some day be a king, no prayer from me this boon should wring, thy cruelty remembering. But if a man is known to live, content at home, is apt to give, and springs of gentle race the wise, with such should form the closest ties." With these words the monkey was lost in a crowd of fellow monkeys. The master here ended his lesson and identified the birth. At that time the old man was the snake charmer, the novice was the monkey, and I myself was the corn merchant. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankinipada. 366. Gumbiya Jataka. Poison like honey, etc. This story was told by the master while dwelling at Jetavana, about a brother who regretted taking orders. The master asked him if it were true that he regretted it. "It is true, holy sir," he said. "What have you seen to cause this feeling?" asked the master. When the brother replied, "It was owing to the charms of a woman," the master said, "These 5 qualities of desire are like the honey sprinkled over with deadly poison, and left in the road by one Gumbika." And hereupon at the request of the brother, he told a story of the past. Once upon a time in the reign of Brahmadatta, king of Benares, the Bodhisattva came to life in a merchant's household. And when he was grown up, he set out from Benares with merchandise on 500 carts for trading purposes. On reaching the high road, at the entrance of a forest, he called together all the members of his caravan and said, "Lo! On this road are leaves, flowers, fruit and the like that are poisonous. In eating see that you take no strange food, without first asking me about it. For demons set in the road baskets of fresh rice and various sweet wild fruits, and sprinkle poison over them. Be sure not to eat of them without my consent." And after uttering this warning, he proceeded on his journey. Then a certain Yaka, named Gumbiya, strewed leaves on a spot in the middle of the forest, and dropping some pieces of honey, covered them with deadly poison, and himself wandered all about the road, pretending to tap the trees, as if he were looking for honey. In their ignorance men thought, "This honey must have been left here as a meritorious act." And then through eating it, they met their death. And the demons came and devoured their flesh. The men also belonging to the Bodhisattva's caravan, some of them being naturally greedy, at the sight of these dainties, could not restrain themselves and partook of them. But those that were wise said, "We will consult the Bodhisattva before we eat," and stood holding it in their hands. And when he saw what they had in their hands, he made them throw it away. And those that had already eaten the whole of it died. But to those who had eaten only half of it, he administered an emetic, and after they had vomited, he gave them the 4 sweet things. And so by his supernatural power they recovered. The Bodhisattva arrived in safety at the place he wished to reach, and after disposing of his wares, he returned to his own house. Poison like honey in look, taste, and smell, was laid by Gumbiya with purpose fell. All who as honey ate the noxious food, through their own greed did perish in the wood. But they who wisely from the bait abstained, were free from torture and at peace remained. So lust like poison bait for man is laid, his heart's desire has oft to death betrayed. But who though frail, besetting sins forego, escape from bonds of suffering and woe. The Master, after delivering these verses inspired by perfect wisdom, revealed the truths and identified the birth. At the conclusion of the truths, the backsliding brother attained the fruit of the first path. At that time I myself was that merchant. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 367, Saliya Jataka. Who got his friend, etc. This was a story told by the Master, whilst living in the bamboo grove, in reference to a saying that Devdatta could not even inspire alarm. When Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, the Bodhisattva was born in the family of a village householder, and when he was young he played with other boys at the foot of a banyan tree, at the entrance of the village. A poor old doctor at that time who had no practice strayed out of the village to this spot, and saw a snake asleep in the fork of a tree, with its head tucked in. He thought, "There is nothing to be got in the village. I will cajole these boys and make the snake bite them, and then I shall get somewhat for curing them." So he said to the Bodhisattva, "If you were to see a young hedgehog, would you seize it?" "Yes, I would," said he. "See, here is one lying in the fork of this tree," said the old man. The Bodhisattva, not knowing it was a snake, climbed up the tree and seized it by the neck. But when he found it was a snake, he did not allow it to turn upon him, but getting a good grip of it, he hastily flung it from him. It fell on the neck of the old doctor, and coiling round him, it bit him so severely that its teeth met in his flesh, and the old man fell down dead on the spot, and the snake made its escape. People gathered together about him, and the great being, in expounding the law to the assembled multitude, repeated these verses. Who got his friend to seize? A deadly snake as hedgehog, if you please. By the snake's bite was killed, as one that evil to his neighbor willed. He that to strike is fain. The man that never striketh back again, is struck and leath low. E'en as this knave sore hurt by deadly blow, so dust that should be thrown against the wind, back in one's face is blown, and ill designed to one that holy is, and has no evil done. On the fool's pate at last, recoils like dust when thrown against the blast. The Master here ended his lesson and identified the birth. At that time the poor old doctor was Devdatta, the wise youth was myself. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 368, Tacasara Jataka. 204. Fallen into hand of foes, etc. This story the Master, whilst dwelling at Jetavana, told concerning the perfection of wisdom. It was then the Master said, "Not now only, brethren, but formerly also the Tathagata proved himself wise and full of resources." And herewith he related an old legend of the past. Once upon a time in the reign of Brahmadatta, king of Benares, the Bodhisattva was born in the household of a village proprietor. The whole story runs on exactly like that of the previous birth. But in this version, when the doctor was dead, his village neighbors said, "These youths have caused the man's death. We will bring them before the king." And they bound them in fetters, and led them to Benares. The Bodhisattva in the course of his journey admonished the other lads and said to them, "Do not be afraid. Even when you are brought into the presence of the king, show yourselves fearless and happy in your mind. The king will first of all talk with us, and afterwards I shall know what to do." They readily acquiesced in what he said, and acted accordingly. When the king found them calm and happy, he said, "These poor wretches have been bound in chains and brought here as murderers, and although they have come to such misery, they are without fear and even happy. I will ask them the reason why they are not troubled." And he repeated the first stanza, "Fallen into hand of foes, and with bamboo fetters bound, how can ye conceal your woes, and with smiling face be found?" On hearing this, the Bodhisattva uttered the remaining verses. "There is no good, however slight, that man from groans and morning air will gain. His adversaries feel delight, when they behold a foe o'ercome with pain. But enemies with grief are filled, when with bold front he goes to meet his fate, and blenches not, as one well skilled, all things with judgment to discriminate, be it by muttered spell or charm, by lavish gifts, or help of powerful kin. that he may best escape from harm. A man should strive some vantage ground to win. But should he fail to reach success, with others' aid or by himself alone, he should not grieve but acquiesce. Fate is too strong, his utmost he has done. The king, on hearing the Bodhisattva's exposition of the law, investigated the matter, and discovering the innocence of the boys, he had their fetters removed, and bestowed much honor on the great being, and made him his temporal and spiritual adviser, and his valued minister. He also conferred honor on the other youths, and appointed them to various offices. When the master had brought this lesson to an end, he identified the birth. At that time Ananda was the king of Benares, the inferior clergy were the other youths, and I myself was the wise youth. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipatta. 369, Mittavinda Jataka. What was the evil? Etc. This story the master whilst living at Jetavana told concerning an unruly brother. The incident that led to the story will be found in the Mahamittavinda birth. Now this Mittavindaka, when cast into the sea, showed himself very covetous, and going on to still greater excess, came to the place of torment inhabited by beings doomed to hell. And he made his way into the Asada hell, taking it to be a city, and there he got a wheel as sharp as a razor fixed upon his head. Then the Bodhisattva in the shape of a god went on a mission to Asada. On seeing him, Mittavindaka repeated the first stanza in the form of a question. What was the evil wrought by me, thus to provoke the curse of heaven, that my poor head should ever be with circling wheel of torture riven? The Bodhisattva on hearing this, uttered the second stanza, forsaking homes of joy and bliss, that decked with pearls with crystal this, and halls of gold and silver sheen. What brought thee to this gloomy scene? Then Mittavindaka replied in a third stanza, far fuller joys I there shall gain, than any these poor worlds can show. This was the thought that proved my bane, and brought me to this scene of woe. The Bodhisattva then repeated the remaining stanzas, from 4 to 8, to 16 thence and so, to 32 insatiate greed doth grow. Thus on and on thou greedy soul wert led, till doomed to wear this wheel upon thy head. So all pursuing covetous desire, insatiate still, yet more and more require the broadening path of appetite they tread, and like thee, bear this wheel upon their head. But while Mittavindaka was still speaking, the wheel fell upon him and crushed him, so that he could say no more. But the divine being returned straight to his celestial abode. The master, his lesson ended, identified the birth. At that time the unruly brother was Mittavindaka, and I myself was the divine being. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipatta. 370 Palasa Jataka. The goose said to the Judas tree, etc. This was a story told by the master, whilst residing at Jetavana, concerning the rebuke of sin. The incident that led to the story will be set forth in the Punna birth. But on this occasion the master addressing the brethren said, Brothers, sin ought to be regarded with suspicion. Though it be as small as a banyan shoot, it may prove fatal. Sages of old too suspected whatever was open to suspicion. And with this he related a story of the past. Once upon a time in the reign of Brahmadatta, king of Benares, the Bodhisattva came to life as a golden gosling. And when he came to be a full-grown goose, he lived in a golden cave, in the Siddhakutta mountain in the Himalaya region, and used to go constantly and eat the wild paddy that grew on a natural lake. On the way by which he went to and fro was a big Judas tree. Both in going and returning, he would always stop and rest there. So a friendship sprang up between him and the divinity that dwelt in that tree. By and by a certain fowl, after eating the ripe fruit of a banyan, came and perched on the Judas tree, and dropped its excrement into the fork of it. Thence there sprang up a young banyan, which grew to the height of 4 inches, and was bright with red shoots and greenery. The royal goose, on seeing this, addressed the guardian deity of the tree and said, My good friend, every tree on which a banyan shoot springs up is destroyed by its growth. Do not suffer this to grow, or it will destroy your place of abode. Go back at once, and root it up and throw it away. One ought to suspect that which justifies suspicion. And thus conversing with the tree sprite the goose, uttered the first stanza. The goose said to the Judas tree, a banyan shoot is threatening thee. What thou dost in thy bosom rear will rend thee limb from limb, I fear. On hearing this, the tree god, not heeding his words, repeated the second stanza. Well, let it grow, and should I be a refuge to the banyan tree, and tend it with a parent's love, it will to me a blessing prove. Then the goose uttered the third stanza. It is a cursed shoot, I fear, thou dost within thy bosom rear. I say goodbye and off I flee. This growth, alas, misliketh me. With these words the royal goose spread out his wings, and made straight for Mount Siddhakuta. Thenceforth he came not back any more. By and by the banyan shoot grew up. This tree also had its guardian deity, and in its growth, it broke down the Judas tree, and with a branch the abode of the tree god also fell. At this moment, reflecting on the words of the royal goose, the tree god thought, the king of the geese foresaw this danger in the future, and warned me of it. But I did not hearken unto his words. And thus lamenting, he uttered the fourth stanza. A spectre grim like Meru's height has brought me to a fearful plight. Scorning the words friend goosey said, I now am overwhelmed with dread. Thus did the banyan, as it grew up, break down all the Judas tree, and reduce it to a mere stump. And the dwelling place of the tree god wholly disappeared. Wise men abhor the parasitic thing that chokes the form to which it loves to cling. The wise, suspecting danger from the weed, destroy the root before it comes to seed. This was the fifth stanza, inspired by perfect wisdom. The master here, his lesson ended, revealed the truths and identified the birth. At the conclusion of the truths 500 brethren attained sainthood. At that time I myself was the golden goose. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 371. Dighitkosala Jataka. Thou art within my power, etc. This story the master, whilst dwelling at Jetavana, told concerning some quarrelsome folk from Kosumbi. When they came to Jetavana, the master addressed them at the time of their reconciliation and said, Brethren, ye are my lawful sons in the faith, begotten by the words of my mouth. Children ought not to trample under foot the counsel given them by their father. But ye follow not my admonition. Sages of old, when the men who had slain their parents and seized upon their kingdom fell into their hands in the forest, did not put them to death, though they were confirmed rebels, but they said, We will not trample on the counsel given us by our parents. And hereupon he related a story of the past. In this birth both the incident that led up to the story, and the story itself will be fully set forth in the Sanghabadaka birth. Now Prince Dagavu, having found the king of Benares lying on his side in the forest, seized him by his top knot and said, Now will I cut into 14 pieces the marauder who slew my father and mother. And at the very moment when he was brandishing his sword, he recalled the advice given him by his parents, and he thought, Though I should sacrifice my own life, I will not trample underfoot their counsel. I will content myself with frightening him. And he uttered the first stanza. Thou art within my power, O king. As prone thou liest here. What stratagem hast thou to bring? Deliverance from thy fear? Then the king uttered the second stanza. Within thy power, my friend, I lie, all helpless on the ground, nor know I any means whereby deliverance may be found. Then the Bodhisattva repeated the remaining verses. Good deeds and words alone, not wealth, O king. In hour of death can any comfort bring. This man abused me that struck me a blow. A third o'ercame and robbed me long ago. All such as harbor feelings of this kind, to mitigate their wrath are ne'er inclined. He did abuse and befame me of yore. He overcame me and oppressed me sore. They who such thoughts refuse to entertain, appease their wrath and live at one again. Not hate, but love alone makes hate to cease. This is the everlasting law of peace. After these words the Bodhisattva said, I will not do thee a wrong, sire, but do thou slay me. And he placed his sword in the king's hand. The king too said, Neither will I wrong thee. And he sware an oath, and went with him to the city, and presented him to his counselors and said, This, sirs, is Prince Dighavu, the son of the king of Kosala. He has spared my life. I may not do him any harm." And so saying, he gave him his daughter in marriage, and established him in the kingdom that had belonged to his father. Thenceforth the two kings reigned happily and harmoniously together. The master here ended his lesson and identified the birth. The father and mother of those days are now members of the royal household, and Prince Dighavu was myself. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 372, Migapotaka Jataka. To sorrow for the dead, etc. This story the master, whilst dwelling at Jetavana, told about a certain elder. It is said that he admitted a youth to orders, and that this novice, after ministering to him zealously, by and by fell sick and died. The old man, overcome with grief at the youth's death, went about loudly lamenting. The brethren, failing to console him, raised a discussion in the hall of truth, saying, "A certain old man on the death of his novice goes about lamenting. By dwelling on the thought of death, he will surely become a castaway." When the master came, he inquired of the brethren what was the subject they had met to discuss. And on hearing what it was, he said, "Not now only, but formerly also, the old man went about lamenting, when this youth died." And with this he related a story of the past. Once upon a time, in the reign of Brahmadatta, king of Bewares, the Bodhisattva was born in the form of Sakka. At that time a man, who lived in the kingdom of Kasi, came into the Himalaya region, and adopting the life of an ascetic, lived on wild fruits. One day he found in the forest a young deer that had lost its dam. He took it home to his hermitage, and fed and cherished it. The young deer grew up a handsome and comely beast, and the ascetic took care of it, and treated it as his own child. One day the young deer died of indigestion from a surfeit of grass. The ascetic went about lamenting and said, "My child is dead." Then Sakka, king of heaven, exploring the world, saw that ascetic, and thinking to alarm him, he came and took his stand in the air, and uttered the first stanza. To sorrow for the dead doth ill become the lone ascetic, free from ties of home. The ascetic no sooner heard this, than he uttered the second stanza. Should man with beast consort, O Sakka, grief, for a lost playmate finds in tears relief. Then Sakka repeated two stanzas. Such as to weep are fain may still lament the dead. Weep not, O sage. 'Tis vain to weep, the wise have said. If by our tears we might prevail against the grave, thus would we all unite our dearest ones to save. While Sakka was thus speaking, the ascetic, recognizing that it was useless to weep, and singing the praises of Sakka, repeated three stanzas. As ghee-fed flame that blazes out amain, is quenched with water, so he quenched my pain. With sorrow's shaft my heart was wounded sore. He healed my wound, and did my life restore. The barb extracted, full of joy and peace. At Sakka's words I from my sorrow cease. After thus admonishing the ascetic, Sakka departed to his own place of abode. The master here ended his lesson and identified the birth. At that time the old man was the ascetic, the novice was the deer, and I myself was Sakka. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 373, Musika Jataka. People cry, "Where is she gone?" etc. This story the master, whilst residing in the bamboo grove, told about Ajatasattu. The incident that led to the story has been already fully told in the Thusa birth. Here too the master observed the king at the same moment playing with his boy, and also listening to the law. And knowing as he did that danger to the king will arise through his son, he said, "Sire, kings of old suspected what was open to suspicion, and kept their heirs in confinement, saying, 'Let them bear rule, after our bodies have been burned on the funeral pyre.'" And with this he told a story of the past. Once upon a time in the reign of Brahmadatta, king of Benares, the Bodhisattva was born in a Brahmin family, and became a world-famed teacher. The son of the king of Benares, Prince Yava, by name, after applying himself diligently to acquire all the liberal arts from him, being now anxious to depart, bade him good-bye. The teacher, knowing by his power of divination that danger would befall the prince through his son, considered how he might remove this danger from him, and began to look about him for an apt illustration. Now he had at this time a horse, and a sore place appeared on its foot. And in order to give proper attention to the sore, the horse was kept to the stable. Now close by was a well, and a mouse used to venture out of its hole, and nibble the sore place on the horse's foot. The horse could not stop it, and one day being unable to bear the pain, when the mouse came to bite him, he struck it dead with his hoof, and kicked it into the well. The grooms, not seeing the mouse, said, "On other days the mouse came and bit the sore place, but now it is not to be seen. What has become of it?" The Bodhisattva witnessed the whole thing and said, "Others from not knowing ask, 'Where is the mouse?' But I alone know that the mouse has been killed by the horse, and dropped into the well." And making this very fact an illustration, he composed the first stanza, and gave it to the young prince. Looking about for another illustration, he saw that same horse, when the boil was healed, go out and make his way to a barley field to get some barley to eat, and thrust his head through a hole in the fence. And taking this as an illustration, he composed a second stanza, and gave it to the prince. But the third stanza he composed by his own mother wit, and gave this also to him. And be said, "My friend, when you are established in the kingdom, as you go in the evening to the bathing tank, walk as far as the front of the staircase, repeating the first stanza, and as you enter the palace in which you dwell, walk to the foot of the stairs, repeating the second stanza, and as you go thence to the top of the stairs, repeat the third stanza." And with these words he dismissed him. The young prince returned home and acted as viceroy, and on his father's death he became king. An only son was born to him, and when he was 16 years old he was eager to be king. And being minded to kill his father, he said to his retainers, "My father is still young. When I come to look upon his funeral pyre, I shall be a worn-out old man. What good will it be for me to come to the throne then?" "My lord," they said, "it is out of the question for you to go to the frontier and play the rebel. You must find some way or other to slay your father, and to seize upon his kingdom." He readily agreed, and went in the evening, and took his sword and stood in the king's palace near the bathing tank, prepared to kill his father. The king in the evening sent a female slave called Musika, saying, "Go and cleanse the surface of the tank. I shall take a bath." She went there, and while she was cleaning the bath, she caught sight of the prince. Fearing that what he was about might be revealed, he cut her in two with his sword, and threw the body into the tank. The king came to bathe. Everybody said, "Today the slave Musika does not return. Where and whither is she gone?" The king went to the edge of the tank, repeating the first stanza. People cry, "Where is she gone? Musika, where hast thou fled? This is known to me alone. In the well she lieth dead." Thought the prince, "My father has found out what I have done." And being panic-stricken he fled, and told everything to his attendants. After the lapse of 7 or 8 days, they again addressed him and said, "My lord, if the king knew he would not be silent. What he said must have been a mere guess. Put him to death." So one day he stood sword in hand at the foot of the stairs. And when the king came he was looking about for an opportunity to strike him. The king came repeating the second stanza, "Like a beast of burden still, thou dost turn and turn about. Thou that Musika didst kill, fain wouldst Yava eat, I doubt." Thought the prince, "My father has seen me," and fled in terror. But at the end of a fortnight he thought, "I will kill the king by a blow from a shovel." So he took a spoon-shaped instrument with a long handle, and stood poising it. The king climbed to the top of the stair, repeating the third stanza, "Thou art but a weakling fool, like a baby with its toy, grasping this long spoon-like tool. I will slay thee, wretched boy." That day being unable to escape, he grovelled at the king's feet and said, "Sire, spare my life." The king, after rating him, had him bound in chains and cast into prison. And sitting on a magnificent royal seat shaded by a white parasol, he said, "Our teacher, a far-famed Brahmin, foresaw this danger to us, and gave us these 3 stanzas." And being highly delighted, in the intensity of his joy he gave forth the rest of the verses. "I am not free by dwelling in the sky, nor by some act of filial piety. Nay, when my life was sought by this my son, escape from death through power of verse was won. Knowledge of every kind he apt to learn, and what it all may signify discern. Though thou shouldst use it not, the time will be, when what thou hearest may advantage thee. By and by on the death of the king the young prince was established on the throne. The master here brought his lesson to a close, and identified the birth. At that time the far-famed teacher was myself. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankunipada. 374. Culladhanuggaha Jataka. Since thou hast gained, etc. This story was told by the master whilst living at Jetavana, about the temptation of a brother by the wife of his unregenerate days. When the brother confessed that it was owing to the wife that he had left, that he regretted having taken orders, the master said, "Not now only, brother. Did this woman do you a mischief? Formerly too it was owing to her that your head was cut off." And at the request of the brethren, he related a story of the past. Once upon a time in the reign of Brahmadatta, king of Benares, the Bodhisattva was reborn as Sakka. At that time a certain young Brahmin of Benares acquired all the liberal arts at Tacasara, and having attained to proficiency in archery, he was known as the clever little archer. Then his master thought, "This youth has acquired skill equal to my own." And he gave him his daughter to wife. He took her, and wishing to return to Benares he set out on the road. Halfway on his journey, an elephant laid waste a certain place, and no man dared to ascend to that spot. The clever little archer, though the people tried to stop him, took his wife and climbed up to the entrance of the forest. Then when he was in the midst of the wood, the elephant rose up to attack him. The archer wounded him in the forehead with an arrow, which piercing him through and through came out at the back of his head, and the elephant fell down dead on the spot. The clever archer, after making this place secure, went on further to another wood, and there 50 robbers were infesting the road. Up to this spot too, though men tried to stop him, he climbed till he found the regular place, where the robbers killed the deer and roasted and ate the venison, close to the road. The robbers, seeing him approach with his gaily attired wife, made a great effort to capture him. The robber chief, being skilled in reading a man's character, just gave one look at him, and recognizing him as a distinguished hero, did not suffer them to rise up against him, though he was single-handed. The clever archer sent his wife to these robbers, saying, "Go and bid them give us a spit of meat, and bring it to me." So she went and said, "Give me a spit of meat." The robber chief said, "He is a noble fellow," and bade them give it her. The robbers said, "What? Is he to eat our roast meat?" And they gave her a piece of raw meat. The archer, having a good opinion of himself, was wroth with the robbers for offering him raw meat. The robbers said, "What? Is he the only man, and are we merely women?" And thus threatening him, they rose up against him. The archer wounded, and struck to the ground 50 robbers, save one with the same number of arrows. He had no arrow left to wound the robber chief. There had been full 50 arrows in his quiver. With one of them he had wounded the elephant, and with the rest the 50 robbers save one. So he knocked down the robber chief, and sitting on his chest bade his wife bring him his sword in her hand, to cut off his head. At that very moment she conceived a passion for the robber chief, and placed the hilt of the sword in his hand, and the sheath in that of her husband. The robber, grasping the hilt, drew out the sword, and cut off the head of the archer. After slaying her husband he took the woman with him, and as they journeyed together he inquired of her origin. "I am the daughter," she said, "of a world-famed professor at Tacasara." "How did he get you for his wife?" he said. "My father," she said, "was so pleased at his having acquired from him an art equal to his own, that he gave me to him to wife. And because I fell in love with you, I let you kill my lawful husband." Thought the robber chief, "This woman now has killed her lawful husband. As soon as she sees some other man, she will treat me too after the same sort. I must get rid of her." And as he went on his way, he saw their path cut off by what was usually a poor little shallow stream, but which was now flooded, and he said, "My dear, there is a savage crocodile in this river. What are we to do?" "My lord," she said, "take all the ornaments I wear, and make them into a bundle in your upper robe, and carry them to the further side of the river, and then come back and take me across." "Very well," he said, and took all her adornments, and going down to the stream, like one in great haste, he gained the other bank, and left her and fled. On seeing this she cried, "My lord, you go as if you were leaving me. Why do you do this? Come back and take me with you." And addressing him she uttered the first stanza. "Since thou hast gained the other side, with all my goods in bundle tied, return as quickly as may be, and carry me across with thee." The robber, on hearing her, as he stood on the further bank, repeated the second stanza. "Thy fancy, lady, ever roves, from well-tried faith to lighter loves. Me too thou wouldst ere long betray, should I not hence flee far away." But when the robber said, "I will go further hence," "You stop where you are," she screamed aloud, and he fled with all her adornments. Such was the fate that overtook the poor fool through excess of passion. And being quite helpless, she drew nigh to a clump of cassia plants, and sat there weeping. At that moment Saka, looking down upon the world, saw her smitten with desire, and weeping for the loss of both husband and lover. And thinking he would go and rebuke her and put her to shame, he took with him Matali and Pankasika, and went and stood on the bank of the river and said, "Matali, do you become a fish? Pankasika, you change into a bird, and I will become a jackal. And taking a piece of meat in my mouth, I will go and place myself in front of this woman. And when you see me there, you, Matali, are to leap up out of the water and fall before me. And when I shall drop the piece of meat I have taken in my mouth, and shall spring up to seize the fish, at that moment you, Pankasika, are to pounce upon the piece of meat, and to fly up into the air, and you, Matali, are to fall into the water." Thus did Saka instruct them, and they said, "Good, my lord." Matali was changed into a fish, Pankasika into a bird, and Saka became a jackal. And taking a piece of meat in his mouth, he went and placed himself in front of the woman. The fish leaping up out of the water fell before the jackal. The jackal, dropping the piece of meat he held in his mouth, sprang up to catch the fish. The fish jumped up and fell into the water, and the bird seized the piece of meat, and flew up into the air. The jackal thus lost both fish and meat, and sat sulkily looking towards the clump of cassia. The woman, seeing this, said, "Through being too covetous, he got neither flesh nor fish." And as if she saw the point of the trick, she laughed heartily. The jackal, on hearing this, uttered the third stanza. "Who makes the cassia thicket ring with laughter, though none dance or sing, or clap their hands, good time to keep? Fair one, laugh not, when thou shouldst weep." On hearing this, she repeated the fourth stanza. "O silly jackal, thou must wish thou hadst not lost both flesh and fish. Poor fool, well mayst thou grieve to see what comes of thy stupidity." Then the jackal repeated the fifth stanza. "Another's faults are plainly seen. 'Tis hard to see one's own, I ween. Methinks thou too must count the cost, when spouse and lover both are lost." On hearing his words she spoke this stanza. "King Jackal, 'tis just as you say, so I will hie me far away, and seek another wedded love, and strive a faithful wife to prove." Then Saka, king of heaven, hearing the words of this vicious and unchaste woman, repeated the final stanza. "He that would steal a pot of clay, would steal a brass one any day. So she who was her husband's bane, will be as bad or worse again." Thus did Saka put her to shame, and brought her to repent, and then returned to his own abode. The master here ended his lesson, and revealed the truths, and identified the birth. At the conclusion of the truths the backsliding brother attained the fruit of the first path. At that time the backsliding brother was the archer, the wife he had left was that woman, and I myself was Saka, king of heaven. Stories of the Buddha's Former Births. Book 5 Pankinipada. 375, Kapota Jataka. I feel quite well, etc. This story the master, whilst dwelling at Jetavana, told concerning a greedy brother. This story of the greedy brother has already been fully told in diverse ways. In this case the master asked him if he were greedy, and on his confessing that it was so said, "Not now only, but formerly also, brother, you were greedy, and through greed came by your death." And herewith he told a story of the past. Once upon a time in the reign of Brahmadatta, king of Benares, the Bodhisattva came to life as a young pigeon, and lived in a wicker cage, in the kitchen of a rich merchant of Benares. Now a crow hankering after fish and flesh made friends with this pigeon, and lived in the same place. One day he caught sight of a lot of fish and meat and thought, "I'll have this to eat." and lay loudly groaning in the cage. And when the pigeon said, "Come, my friend, let us sally out for our food," he refused to go, saying, "I am laid up with a fit of indigestion. Do you go?" And when the pigeon was gone, he said, "My troublesome enemy is off. I will now eat fish and meat to my heart's content." And so thinking, he repeated the first stanza. "I feel quite well and at my ease. Since Mr. Pigeon off is gone, my cravings I will now appease. Pot herbs and meat should strengthen one." So when the cook who was roasting the fish and meat came out of the kitchen, wiping away streams of sweat from his person, the crow hopped out of his basket and bit himself in a basin of spices. The basin gave forth a click sound, and the cook came in haste, and seizing the crow pulled out his feathers, and grinding some moist ginger and white mustard he pounded it with a rotten date, and smeared him all over with it, and rubbing it on with the potsherd he wounded the bird. Then he fastened the potsherd on his neck with a string, and threw him back into the basket, and went off. When the pigeon came back and saw him, he said, "Who is this crane lying in my friend's basket? He is a hot-tempered fellow, and will come and kill this stranger." And thus jesting, he spoke the second stanza. "Child of the clouds, with tufted crest, why didst thou steal my poor friend's nest? Come here, Sir Crane. My friend the crow has a hot temper, you must know." The crow, on hearing this, uttered the third stanza. "Well mayst thou laugh at such a sight, for I am in a sorry plight. The cook has plucked and basted me with rotten dates and spicery." The pigeon, still making sport of him, repeated the fourth stanza. "Bathed and anointed well, I think. Thou hast thy fill of food and drink. Thy neck so bright with jewel sheen. Hast thou, friend, to Benares been?" Then the crow repeated the fifth stanza. "Let not my friend or bitterest foe on visit to Benares go. They pluck me bare and as a jest have tied a potsherd on my breast." The pigeon, hearing this, repeated the final stanza. "These evil habits to outgrow is hard with such a nature, crow. Birds should be careful to avoid the food they see by man enjoyed." After thus reproving him, the pigeon no longer dwelt there, but spread his wings and flew elsewhere. But the crow died then and there. The master here ended his lesson, and revealed the truths and identified the birth. At the conclusion of the truths, the greedy brother attained fruition of the second path. At that time the crow was the greedy brother, the pigeon was myself.